This episode of the Wolf Connection podcast is sponsored by Wolfish by Erica Berry. The audiobook is read by Lessa Lamb and is on sale now. Download Wolfish wherever you get your audiobooks and start listening. There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod, and for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some wolves. Really an impromptu podcast, and I think my guest, Stephen, is not with me on this one, but just for the flexibility and obviously the importance and the timing of what we're talking about today, he is the research and program director at Living with Wolves, but he's been doing this type of outreach and this type of work for well over 2 decades. He is Garrick Dutcher. Garrick, thank you so much for, again, I know the turnaround time is short. I know you have a lot going on and a lot on your plate, but I appreciate you joining me and really diving into this issue for as little time as we have. So thank you so much for that. How's everything going today for you just in Idaho at the moment?
Busy. It's my pleasure, John. Thank you for inviting me to do this. It's been quite busy trying to keep track of what's going on and trying to inform the public. And that's why I took this opportunity, because we can get to an audience this way, and any opportunity to do that is what I'm doing, whether it's, through more traditional media outlets or whatever. So here we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is fantastic. And I thank you so much for that. Let's dive right in, because we were sort of getting into the outskirts of what's happening. So for those that are going to be listening to this, odds are this will be after the Idaho plan has been finalized, and we've been putting on our social to get people to comment about the plan, because the public comment period, I believe, ends on March 6th, which is Monday. So just give everybody, I guess, Garrick, the sense of the road where Idaho is heading at this point, because there have been articles coming out in early February talking about this management plan that is going to span 6 years. They're looking to, I believe, cut the population by upwards of 60% down to somewhere in the 500 range. Just tell everybody why the Idaho is choosing this route, and what the process of how this is happening in a state like this, and why these extreme measures are being taken to get to that number.
Okay. It's a lot to unpack there.
A lot to unpack. Yeah, I know.
So going back a little ways, wolves were delisted ultimately in 2011 in the Northern Rockies DPS, of which includes the entire geography of Idaho. Post-delisting, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a 5-year oversight period in which they are watching more carefully. There's some funding that goes to the states in the areas where the wolves were delisted from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are expected to, demonstrate proper, responsible management, socially responsible management. And during that period, they monitor the population and keep an eye on how things are going. And in fact, the language is that they're supposed to demonstrate adequate regulatory mechanisms. That is what is mandated by the Endangered Species Act. And then as those 5 years expire, the states have more latitude to do, they don't really have the latitude to do as they please, but in this case they did, because the oversight period was over, and there was this gradual incremental ramping up the pressure on wolves. So the justification in what the plan itself states is that this is being done in order to address what they call chronic depredation of livestock and struggling elk herds. Now, both of those issues are sort of a red herring in the state of Idaho. And I can explain that. But I also want to emphasize that the 60% reduction that they are targeting is on top of an already 13% reduction that had happened in the last calendar year. So let's see. Perhaps you want to give me, let me know what direction you want me to take this.
Yeah, I think, and that's a good point that you bring up, and I think maybe people don't notice that like you said, and I'm glad you brought that up, that the 60 is on top of already the 13% that already has. I think the rough estimates were that the population was around 1,500. I think now it sits somewhere at 13 and change, I think is what I was reading. If that's accurate, and if I stumble anyway, please let me know. And so I guess really just dive into the extreme measures that are really making this, that would have to make this possible.
Well, and that's what touches on the adequate regulatory mechanisms phrase, and what I believe is catching the attention of the federal government, because paying bounties for killing wildlife is essentially what's going on in Idaho and now in Montana. And that is, reverting back to 19th century policy in 2023, and here we are facing these really barbaric practices, especially since the majority of those bounties go through to trappers, and trapping is a rather archaic practice that I don't think a lot of people in America realize is still around to this degree as it is today. In fact, I don't know of any other examples anywhere in the world where trapping isn't being pulled back on and is actually being advanced, except for the states of Idaho and Montana, and in the context of wolves. Now, I want to point out one of the issues with the population estimate. Well, we don't know for certain that this model of camera trapping is an effective way of doing this. There are lots of questions. There's a lot of challenges by scientists to this methodology. I am not going to say that I can tell you one way or the other whether this is an accurate form of counting wolves, but there certainly is a lot of raising of eyebrows by this new form of counting wolves. But some of the real basic things that are obviously true about it is that the camera traps are estimating a population between July and August. That is peak population. That is post litter. That's when the most wolves are on the landscape during the calendar year. And then historically, it was always done in midwinter, which was leading up to the breeding season. And since wolves, especially a highly exploited population of wolves, they're smaller packs, and so there's more litters, there's greater pup mortality as a consequence of that. However, they've chosen to count wolves at the peak annual cycle versus the minimal annual cycle, and that cycle varies quite a lot. So if their numbers were correct, that 1,500 was the figure, then the range they were talking about then was peak season was around 1,600 and the low was around 800. So if you were to go back to when they were counting wolves in midwinter with flights and which was the traditional way of counting wildlife, large big game species, then the population really would be more in line with calling it around 800, not 1,500. So I think that's an important little tidbit not to overlook. When Idaho Fish and Game reset the methodology, they chose to count in peak numbers season.
That's such a wild discrepancy to be able to base this plan that is radically coming down the pike here for all those in Idaho. Why do you think, over all the years that you've been here and you've been doing this work, that this is the way that they are choosing to go? Is it simply because, and we've spoken with Carter Niemeyer about this, we've spoken with Casey York from Trap Free Montana, and it all seems to echo the same, and I wonder if you feel the same, that there is a lot of political motivation from individuals who feel that these wolves were brought to that, reintroduced not in a way that they wanted to. And so this is really their way of getting back either at the federal government or back at pro-wolf individuals because it was sort of done not in a way that doesn't benefit them. Do you feel that this is the way, why they're rolling these policies out, why the legislative is the way it is, why the bills are being proposed the way they are, and why the numbers want to be reduced to this low of a population, as you were stating before?
Yes.
That's a simple answer. There you go.
So to take this in a little bit different direction, Fish and Game in Idaho, and I suspect it's similar in other states, at least in the Northern Rockies, is in the business of selling the lives of deer and elk. That is the revenue generator for them. And they also need to take responsibility for elk and deer that are, they're forced to take responsibility for the elk and deer that go down into the valleys and, as they call it, depredate on crops, causing, millions of dollars worth of losses to agriculture every year. Now, so these, the Fish and Game therefore is under pressure from the Idaho State Legislature, which is heavily influenced by the Department of Agriculture, and a lot of the state legislators are from agricultural backgrounds. So Idaho's wildlife definitely takes a back seat to agriculture and hunting, especially carnivores, because hunting, as I mentioned, is in Idaho is done in the interest of growing elk and deer for the consumption of hunters that, pay for that. So it is not by any stretch, wildlife management in the interest of ecology. They often refer to the social carrying capacity of wolves on the landscape. Well, I believe that a biological carrying capacity would be a much better measure by which to look at what number of wolves should belong in a place like Idaho. Social carrying capacity, especially when the people you're mostly listening to are the people who are involved in agriculture or hunting, is already going to be quite biased against large carnivores. Then as the landscape gets, more and more occupied by humanity and human interests, that social carrying capacity is on a slippery slope to become less and less over time. So I don't believe that is a metric that needs to be, I think, we see the expansion of humanity globally, and we have a choice whether or not we want to try to preserve natural systems as best we can. And in order to do that, so social carrying capacity should not be a leading driving concept behind what a healthy population of large carnivores specifically would look like.
Yeah, and it seems that it seems to be the real pin in this entire conversation is really the social tolerance aspect, and really getting away from the biological or ecological carrying capacity of a population of carnivores like this. We're seeing now that grizzly bears are on the docket next, that they're trying to delist grizzly bears as well. And so it just seems like it's there's an attack there for these large carnivores. I want to read something. There's an article here that I had pulled up from Field and Stream, and there was a quote that kind of struck me right before you and I got on. And it was, where was it now? And of course I had it up and now it's gone. Okay, so here it is. So this is Dr. Shriver. I think if I'm saying that correctly, on the Western Huntsman podcast, said that wolf management's been a prime focal point, and this is the quote from the article here. So
do you have his first name?
Let me see. Roger Phillips. I don't see it.
So Roger Phillips is Fish and Game. Are you speaking of Ed Shriver, the recently departed director of Idaho Fish and Game?
Possibly, yes. It says Director Shriver, yes.
Okay.
So that's possible that that's him, yes. So the quote here says, "Our intent is not to exterminate wolves, but to manage them so they are represented on the landscape, that they have the ability to be there, but not to a degree that they're detrimental to the values that we have here in Idaho." Does that essentially speak to what you were saying just before, is that the value the value of carnivore on the landscape in Idaho is less than the value of ungulate and prey species that are here in this ecological system. Is that essentially what he's saying in a roundabout situation?
100%. And that turns a blind eye to natural systems. And therefore, you have this strong favoring of growing elk and deer for consumption. Director Schriever is entirely, taking a utilitarian perspective on nature here. I don't believe that that's a sustainable way going forward. Especially, I believe that in a place like Idaho, where we have such large wilderness areas, millions of acres of wilderness, and roughly 66% of the state is publicly owned lands and wild spaces where private enterprise in the form of domestic livestock rearing is operating on those lands and killing our native wildlife for conflicts with those livestock. It is similarly seen that those lands by Fish and Game are a place to grow elk, but not wolves, bears, lions, mountain lions. So, yeah, that's the problem, is that he's interpreting the values of hunters as the reason to do everything, where nationwide, I'm not sure where it is, but it's somewhere below 5% of this nation hunts, and there is room for sustainable hunting and alongside healthy wildlife populations or populations of large carnivores that can help mitigate disease outbreaks in ungulate herds. We've seen the ecological benefits of large carnivores, specifically wolves. You've probably touched on that with a lot of guests, as well as the fact that there is a lot of effective non-lethal tools that promote coexistence, that allow for livestock, on public lands, once again, let me remind you, to coexist with the native wildlife. And so it's critical to recognize, for those who aren't aware of it, that these are your public lands that your tax dollars support. And unfortunately, here in Idaho, if you're an Idahoan, your tax dollars go to funding the Wolf Control Board, which spends about $1 million a year just to kill wolves, which is completely frivolous and unnecessary because it's counterproductive. I want to point out one other thing along these lines, and that is that for the last 3 years, according to the Fish and Game's camera trapping methodology, they were sustaining 1,500 wolves, while the elk population was either stable at 120,000 or increasing, depending on which report you read from Fish and Game. The most recent, from October of 2022, the elk and deer specialist said that he believes that we are about to exceed the all-time high of the population of elk in the state, which was 125,000. So I don't understand, and they can point to a few struggling herds or areas where they have objectives that are not that are below objectives, the elk population. However, statewide, there are a lot of elk, and people are hunting those elk, and there are wolves where elk are, because that's what they eat. So it's really difficult to reconcile the justification of this plan. In fact, it's not just difficult, it's really impossible, because there is no reconciling the logic that they're pursuing here. Let's talk about livestock real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
In Idaho, so the definition of chronic depredation, these zones are rather large, really large. Idaho is a huge state. So if you have the loss of one head of livestock, cattle, sheep, in 4 out of 5 years, that's either confirmed or even probable, so that's really quite vague, then you have a zone that qualifies for chronic depredation. So that's an incredibly low bar, especially when you think about the fact that there are millions of cattle and sheep. There's about 300,000 sheep and more than 2 million head of cattle out on the landscape in Idaho. So those figures show that this is a nominal or almost non-existent problem. If you are the producer that loses livestock, you can get a financial hit, and it is a real loss, and that is something that needs to be addressed. But it should be addressed first through non-lethal, especially if it's on public lands. There is some inherent risk to doing business and paying pennies on the dollar for your grazing permit on public lands, where there is weather and all kinds of natural dangers that should be included as part of those natural dangers that large carnivores live on that landscape.
So, Garrick, you mentioned a couple things here and you answered, I think, one of my questions, but this correlation with elk depredation, chronic wasting disease, elk also coming onto ranchers' land, eating the hay. There's been talk of that happening. Why doesn't the community see that if you allow an overabundance of ungulates, you're going to have interference with ranching as well as if you have wolves on the lands? In other words, like, ungulates are impacting livestock in a way because you're having them they're coming on their land, they're basically grazing, they're eating their hay, they're damaging fencing, things like that. We've heard about these stories. Why is this sort of an allowable occurrence as opposed to wolves that depredate less than, I think, 1/10 of livestock really in the West?
Because agriculture is king in the West. And when I say that, I don't believe that is the perspective of the average citizen. But I had mentioned that our legislature is well populated by people with ag interests. Big Ag has a lot of hands in Idaho politics. And so, yeah, they'll, when a farmer is losing crops, that individual is upset, and Fish and Game does what it can to get the elk out of there. But, once you have elk in a cornfield, they're unlikely to go away on their own, no matter how much hazing you do. It's well irrigated in an arid landscape. So the food there is fresh and juicy. And it's, right there, easy to access. So, but wolves, as you had mentioned, were brought back by the federal government. I don't believe that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did enough groundwork to prepare the public. That absence of information was filled by the big bad wolf of legend and mythology, that wolves were going to be doing things that proved not to be true. Just as I mentioned, when you look at all-time high wolf population in Idaho coinciding with an all-time high elk population in Idaho. So, but yet, barstool biology, coffee shop biology, whatever you want to call it, is prolific. And quite often when people don't agree with Fish and Game, they challenge what Fish and Game has to say as well, even though Fish and Game largely panders to its constituents in the consumptive, the branch of humanity that consumes wildlife rather than goes to enjoy it in other ways.
So when we're looking at the consumptive community to the I guess the watching community, I don't know how else to really put it. Somebody who enjoys the wildlife, they go out, they view it, when, like, they would go to Yellowstone. So you're going to view the elk, you're going to view the bison, the pronghorn, the wolves, the bears, everybody else. Is there any crossing the aisle from any of those factions to really meet in the middle and understand that, this is not really a pitting against each other, but is there any sort of common ground that can be found there, or is everyone sort of backed in the corner? Yeah, go ahead if there's something there.
Both, I don't like to call it sides because there's a lot of commonality there.
Right.
Resource extraction and the degradation of our natural environment is the enemy of both of those groups. Okay. So,
right.
because, and it's not just people going to watch wildlife. I would say that, mountain climbers and bird watchers and kayakers and backpackers and, peak baggers and backcountry skiers and all these
Absolutely.
people that are enjoying the public lands of this country are also enjoying the wildlife they see and appreciate it. And nothing is more exciting than to see a large carnivore. That is the story that's told. It's not like, hey, I saw a herd of deer. So we have that in common, that our wildlife that we enjoy, whether we consume it or not, needs habitat, and habitat is under threat through climate change, but also through development. And that is a big issue, especially in a place like many areas around Montana.
Right.
And even in the valley that I live in here in Idaho. So,
Yeah.
wildlife gets pushed out as more people come in, and it makes life for a cow isn't as hard, because if you're not going to slaughter, you're coming back in for the winter. Everyone else, all the wild ungulates, make a living out there year round, and so do the carnivores.
Right.
So I believe that there's room in these states to allow a much more natural system to occur. Unfortunately, we don't do that in Idaho. This new plan is going to push it even further in the opposite direction. I was listening to Director Shriver speak in front of the legislators, and he was pointing out, and I've got the quote somewhere here, that the smaller the pack, the more hunting and the more trapping, the smaller the pack, because research shows that human-caused mortality leads to packs falling apart.
Instability. Yeah.
And then packs might form smaller packs. A pair will breed and have a litter. What he pointed out and was advocating for was basically pup starvation. He pointed out that when you have small packs, you have higher mortality, and that is in the form of pups starving. So, our former director was promoting small packs before the legislature, and that should really be exposed for what it is, because I don't think most Americans would stand behind that kind of thing, especially for such a highly social animal that lives in these very complex and interesting family groups where they support each other, they work together. You have a pack. You usually have a hunting party. It needs to be at least 4 individuals to be able to, statistically, to be able to secure an elk most of the time, right? That's the breaking point, is 4 and under, or below 4. So when you have a pair trying to hunt an elk, or a single wolf trying to hunt an elk, it's much less successful. But 4 and above, it's a pretty high success rate. Now, if it were bison, in parts of Yellowstone, you need a larger hunting party. So in considering that, the other thing that happens in the spring is when there's a litter of puppies born, usually 1 or 2 wolves will stay back with those pups while a hunting party goes out. They're there to protect the pups, to keep them from wandering off as they're growing older and exploring, and to keep them safe from dangers. Well, if you're just a pair, you already don't have your hunting party, nor do you have someone to stay back with the pups, and so you have increased pup mortality. So our agency's director here in Idaho was flagging that if we can keep packs small, more will die.
Man, it's just, yeah. I mean, we had Kira Cassidy on to promote that research that was just done about pack, human caused mortality and pack instability. And you're right. And obviously we've seen this in a lot of the bills that are coming down in Montana, a lot of the bills that are here that you're talking about in Idaho. Is there, and I'm deviating for just a slight second, because there was something that just came to my mind, and I think you touched on it briefly. Is there issues with privatization of land also coming in Idaho? Because you talk about the privatization of wildlife in a sense that you're growing elk and deer for the hunting and outfitting community. Is there also the issue of that land being privatized so that we're pushing out those who need to actually hunt those elk and deer for food and for sustenance hunting. Because I feel like that's another issue that I believe we touched on with either Carden Niemeyer and Nick Givok. And that seems to be becoming more of a trend where pulling out more of the population human-wise that can actually gain access to this wildlife and these wild lands. Is that something that's also compounding upon this issue with wolves and getting these numbers done?
It makes it harder for the ungulates, especially when
Right.
the valley bottoms get developed. And that is an impact that's not being. It's everything. It's easy to blame wolves and large carnivores, and that is the problem. This is scapegoating, and it's not actually. The wrong causes are being identified. There's also habitat transitions that occur. Great large forest fires create the right kind of habitat for elk several years later because they feed on grass. They proliferate when there is a lot of grass to be consumed. They don't do well in mature forests, right? And so some historic herds have been greatly diminished because of habitat shifts, and that's been identified by Fish and Game, yet they're still calling these predator pits because they see lions, bears, and wolves continuing to keep the population of ungulates in those places below objectives. And yes, there are those carnivores there, feeding on elk that are less robust and smaller numbers and in harder habitat for where they would normally prefer to exist. Yet then in other areas where there had been a recent fire, there are, and recent, I mean, it needs the soil, depending on the temperature of the fire, the habitat needs some time to cool off chemically before the grasses can do well. So there is those, unfortunately, Fish and Game isn't that adaptive to consider those natural processes in a lot of cases. And so the answer is kill the anything that's consuming the elk you want to sell. So back to real quickly to Kira Cassidy's research, I want to emphasize that our nation, we are quick to criticize, and rightfully so, countries like Norway and Japan where whaling still exists. We're quick to be judgmental of the culling of the African elephant where it's inconvenient to villages and crops. And we're quick to criticize the enslavement of the Asian elephant in labor and entertainment. That is all because, and what's going on with the great apes. These are all highly social animals, family-based animals that live around the world, but not in our backyard. And here we have the wolf living here in our backyard, equally social, and a very intelligent animal. Yet we choose to manage them through population metrics and not in consideration of their social nature and the fact that they do live in these complex families and they do need a certain amount of adults to be able to successfully raise a year of pups. So we should, perhaps look inward a little bit here and consider what we're doing with our own social animal here on our own landscape. If it's inconvenient for us, maybe we can find a way in the United States of America, this leading nation of the world, to find the space and the tolerance and embrace coexistence and allow for hunting and livestock and native carnivores to coexist because we know it's possible.
I love that point, Garrick, because you really hit that. It's amazing when you look in the mirror and you turn it on yourself. Maybe not you specifically. I'm just saying humans as a species, in that we are systematically destroying family systems, like you say, complex family systems in these specific species. Which it's a great point that you just brought up, because when you say it that way, when you look at, like you say, whales, elephants, wolves, orcas to a degree, those are family systems that, like you say, they need to have that structure. They need to have that learning system brought down by generations, just like human beings. We
That's
don't learn the things that we would learn from our grandparents, our great grandparents, our fathers and mothers, if those people are ripped from us at an early stage, and we don't get that learning and that teaching. And that, I believe you're absolutely right, that gets lost in a lot of the politics and the yelling at, each faction yelling at each other, and understanding that if we just treated them as we would ourselves and looking at it inwardly, like you say, we may have a different perspective on this entire situation.
Right. Well, I think our value system is correct to, want to preserve these highly intelligent social animals around the planet, as we should for all keystone species and apex predators and these animals that hold a vital role in natural systems. We know that when they don't exist, that biological systems are more impoverished. They're less dynamic. They're less rich. There's a rise of the mid-level carnivore, the mesocarnivore, and that affects everything. So I think we would be wise to look at this carefully and cast the same opinion on ourselves and find a way forward. And we know that there are solutions. We know that coexistence is very feasible, and we know that wolves are not absolutely destroying wild ungulates, and we know there can be room for hunting as well. So it's a lot of Chicken Little, sky is falling,
Right.
going on, and it's really unfortunate, and a lot of people, I think, really believe in it. However, the statistics just don't support that. Once again, all-time record, elk population, and I think in not just Idaho, but Montana and Wyoming, alongside, the highest wolf population we've seen since prior to them being extirpated in the 1930s and such.
Right. What's something? What are a few things? Because I know you're tight on time here, and I want to get this in. If you were to say anything to the people listening to this, because there's going to be a lot of people who want to know this information. When this plan ultimately comes out, what are the things they're going to be looking at that the public should really be focused on? And I know this will be after the plan is out, the public comment period is gone. But what is it that the public needs to know, needs to research, and ultimately understand where Idaho could feasibly be headed with this plan when it gets finalized and then it's put into place?
Well, I think only the federal government will be able to take Idaho off this course, and Idaho may have gotten radical enough in these policies to have triggered that. We will see. And should that happen, then it's a different ball game. But it matters who you vote for. And we have a certain electorate in Idaho that is different than it is in other states. And we need to have our elected officials, if this is where your values lie, state their position on wildlife management, on public lands, and on issues such as native carnivores, not just wolves, grizzly bears as well, and mountain lions. It's important that our representatives take up these issues because, we do have really great wild spaces that can support a lot of wildlife and balanced wildlife. I know people don't like the term balanced, but certainly we know what imbalance looks like. And so I think it's important to demand of your candidates that they take a position on these issues so you know where they stand. And then it's a values question. Is the landscape for just growing elk and deer? If only 5% of Americans or less, fewer than that, actually hunt, then why is that the priority? Why can we not strive for portions of our great open spaces to be much more representative of a whole natural community of all species.
Absolutely. I can't agree with you more. I just have two more things for you, Garrick. The first one, you did mention if Idaho has actually triggered this federal government intervention. Is there any insight you could give to what that would look like, or do you have any idea what that would entail if the federal government does in fact have to step in, if these measures are in fact for them too extreme and too far to one side?
Well, the justification is there for them already, simply in the language of adequate regulatory mechanisms. Not only are those mechanisms not in place, but they're embracing these archaic and really insidious practices, such as paying bounties, that demonstrate that, it's the stated goal is to drastically reduce our wolf population to numbers that, we would have close to 10 times more mountain lions in Idaho once they reach that point. We have about 4,000 mountain lions in Idaho, somewhere around that. We have about 20,000 black bears. We've got, it's, and then we've got what, 1,000 wolves, 1,300 wolves, something like that, depending on what time of year you're counting and whose model you believe. And there is no reason to do this. There's no justification to do this. And I think that is pretty clear to the federal government. I think what will trigger them is if they feel that these activities are going to threaten the species. And, from the benchmarks made during early delisting rules, we have learned a lot more about genetic connectivity and interchange, that how important that is to have genetic exchange between populations. And we've also learned that the landscape can sustain a lot more wolves than originally thought, and without seeing the depletion of these ungulate populations or dramatic impacts on livestock. It is a very small number. I wish I had it right here in front of me, but it is not a whole lot of livestock that are being killed. Again, if you're that individual, it hurts, and those people need to be worked with and supported, so that they're not taking a huge hit, because it is all of our wildlife, and those are our wolves. And so, if they're getting into livestock, well, hopefully the producer is working to protect those livestock. And if they are, then, there should be some accommodations to those producers.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Garrick, and everything you're saying is such a balanced approach. And I believe, again, I really truly believe there's more individuals in the middle than there are, I think, on these polar opposites. And hopefully this information will give people just, again, more incentive to hopefully either reach across to someone who might not think the way they do, and also just invigorate them more to really get the gumption to step into their beliefs more and go at it the correct way, and understand of how this is all interconnected and interwoven, because we all are on this landscape together, and it has to be that way. Otherwise, the sum of the parts is the best part. We want everybody to be involved in this. My last question for you, Garrick, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
Oh, wild, wilderness, majestic, a species that helps regulate from, the entire system. Wolves don't determine prey populations, and prey populations don't determine wolf numbers. They coexist. They have far before there was even Native Americans on this landscape. And they've done so in a way that hasn't caused extinction. And we are now in according to fossil record, the sixth extinction spasm in the history of our planet, and it is at the hands of men and or humankind. We are responsible for being the stewards of this planet, and if there's room for wolves to run, then there's going to be a pretty healthy system.
I agree with that. Garrick, just stick around for 1 minute when we close here. Garrick Dutcher, thank you so much for your time. I know you're on a time crunch, and thank you for gracing me with your presence and giving everyone this information and being the steward that you are, sir. And I appreciate you and all the work that you and Living with Wolves does.
John, thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. House to you all out there, and we'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.